Depending on what the nature of the problem is that the parties need to dispute, CEDR has some brilliant mediators who they can pull in, and provided the parties are happy and there's no conflict of interest obviously between the mediator and the parties involved, the parties can feel confident that they're getting a market-leading mediator. I'm Amrik Kandola, I'm a CEDR panel mediator, and I'm also on the faculty for the MST mediation course.
One other area which you have a lot of expertise in is the construction sector. So looking at how disputes are kind of handled in that sector, traditionally how have parties gone about resolving disputes in the construction sector? Okay,
so historically the construction sector has been probably one of the most adversarial sectors of all the sectors. I mean, in some respects that's not entirely surprising, but court cases, a lot of the court cases that you see are often drawn from the construction sector. So I think it's fair to say that historically construction has been a very prolific area for work for the courts. Even so far as it's got its own specific court that deals with its problems, which is the Technology and Construction Court, of course. And also, as a direct result of what was perceived as being a very, very adversarial part of the market when it came to disputes, of course, we had the introduction of the Housing Grants Construction and Regeneration Act in the late 90s, in 1996 actually, which actually was designed to try and move the industry away from what seemed to be a propensity for cases to end up in the courts, and to try and at least take cases out of the court system and get them resolved in a quicker, more efficient manner. And that's what adjudication was all about, which was born out of the Construction Act that came in 1996.
So looking at adjudication, is this something that parties are using a lot at the moment? And if so, what are the benefits of adjudication, but also the drawbacks? Yeah,
well, since the adjudication came in, and the Act came in 1996, but it didn't come into force until 1998. And since then, I think it's fair to say that adjudication has changed the landscape for the way that people resolve disputes in the construction sector. So it is the most popular way for parties to resolve problems. There is no doubt about it, if parties are looking for a third-party determination of the problem. And I think there have been thousands of adjudications, literally, since it came into force. So it's a very popular way of doing it, and I think it's achieved a lot of what the government set out to achieve, which is to try and take cases out of the court system and provide a mechanism for getting a third-party decision about the problem through a process which was quicker and more efficient and arguably more cost-effective than going to trial, particularly in cases like, for example, non-payment. So those kind of failure to pay subcontractors or subcontractors, whatever else, where they were just struggling, because cash flow is key in the construction industry. So this idea that people should have a very simple, straightforward way of recovering money where monies are being unlawfully withheld from them was seen as a major reason for bringing adjudication in. What has also happened, though, is that adjudication has become the main way that construction disputes are resolved, no matter what the issue is. So what you're now finding, and we've been finding for a few years now, I think, is that very, very complicated situations within the construction industry are also being dealt with through adjudication. And I suspect one of the concerns is whether or not some of these cases are really suitable for adjudication, insofar as actually have adjudications become equally as expensive, equally as inefficient, and equally as time-consuming as what the old court case system used to be. And certainly there are examples out there where a single adjudication goes on for months and months and months because the issues are so complex, the values are so high, and actually it's become not necessarily an alternative to the court system, it's just become another way of doing it, but the costs and etc. are not that different. Now that's not in every case, and I think in the vast majority of cases I think adjudication has been highly successful, but it's not necessarily the panacea for everything. So I think there are some issues with adjudication, and depending on the nature of the dispute, it's still a process whereby parties come and get a third-party determination on the issues that are presented. So it's still got that DNA, which is there's a dispute, you give it to a third party, they give you an answer, they give you a decision. So one of the issues, I guess, around adjudication is still this idea, well, actually, if you want to try and preserve relationships, mend relationships, build relationships, adjudication, whilst it may give you an answer, the problem is not necessarily focused on the future working relationship between the parties and taking some of these broader issues into account.
What about the swiftness of it? Is it still, if parties are looking for a decision or they're looking to solve an issue in a relatively quick time period, is adjudication still a good mechanism?
Yeah, well, for sure. I mean, technically speaking, within 28 days of referring a dispute to adjudication, you get a decision. Now, it's quite common for the 28 days to be extended by 14 days, for example. But often, as I said before, some of these more complex cases, the 28 days very quickly could quite quickly turn into 3 months, 6 months, even longer. But yeah, for a lot of cases, it's a very efficient and quick way of securing a decision to a problem.
Moving beyond adjudication or parking that for a second and looking now at mediation, what does mediation offer parties in dispute in the construction sector that adjudication doesn't? Okay,
so adjudication at its heart is still a process where the parties present their case to an adjudicator who's effectively an arbiter, who's then going to make a decision. He will decide, or she will decide, who is right, who is wrong, what the answer is to the problem based on the submissions that the parties make. So essentially it's still an adversarial process with a decision being made by a third party. So at the heart of it, it still is that process of third party determination. What a mediation does, of course, is allow the parties to find their own solution to the problem. And because they're finding their own solution to the problem, they don't just have to think about the particular issue, but they can broaden the conversation into a conversation about the relationships, about some of the other things that come into play, which would not be available within the context of adjudication. In the same way as the court is not interested really in what the future relationship of the parties is. The court is simply there to give an answer to the problem that's presented. And adjudication is basically the same thing. So what mediation allows the parties to do is find solutions which are based on parties themselves finding an answer to the problem, finding a mutually acceptable solution to the problem, which allows them to also then bring other factors into play which they simply could not do through an adversarial process like adjudication.
And now kind of turning our attention to kind of the international arena when it comes to construction mediation or mediating in that sector. Do you have any experience of mediating international construction cases? Yeah,
so quite a few of the cases that come along, you'll have a party from a different jurisdiction that's involved, either because the project is in the UK, but you've got either suppliers or contractors who come from abroad, or indeed if you've got people from the UK effectively, working on a project overseas. I think again, mediation provides a really, really interesting alternative because ultimately, when you're trying to find a workable solution for the parties are trying to find their own resolution to the problem. There isn't the same tension in terms of trying to reconcile different jurisdictions in terms of who's if it's an arbitration, what's the choice of law, what's the seat of the arbitration in terms of where does it need to go. If people are mediating the dispute, a lot of those issues can be parked to one side and the parties simply focus on reaching a commercial resolution to the problem. And it's interesting actually that a few years ago there was this kind of view, and I think fair, that different parts of the world had a different approach to the usefulness of mediation in the context of it being a way of resolving disputes. But I certainly think over the last few years there has been a massive move across the entire globe actually that mediation is now an accepted way of resolving disputes across the world. And certainly if one looks at the North American market, the European market, mediation is very much now embedded as a standard almost like just a very common way, a standard way of approaching problems. You know, you look at mediation, the court processes in those jurisdictions make it very clear that even if it's not mandatory, although that's something that could be coming soon, who knows, but there's still a strong encouragement to mediate in the way that costs are dealt with, for example, in the UK and in some other jurisdictions. But even in other jurisdictions, perhaps in Africa, in Southeast Asia, etc., all of a sudden now mediation is becoming extremely popular, and people are beginning to turn to mediation as a natural way of resolving problems. And of course, it's still relatively recent that the Singapore Convention was signed up by parties, which then allows the recognition of mediated settlements across, you know, as being enforceable agreements. So it seems to me that the move across the world now to accept mediation as a normal standard way of resolving disputes is very much becoming embedded in the culture and in the mindset of everybody.